My name is Miley Dawson. The moment my older brother laughed at me across our mother's living room, something inside me finally snapped. He didn't just tease me, he mocked me as if I were a running joke. "Still jobless? Must be nice having nothing to do all day," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His friends erupted in laughter, clinking their drinks as if celebrating my supposed failure. They assumed I had no career, they assumed I had no ambition, they assumed I had no power. What they didn't realize was that every single one of them worked for me. Not metaphorically, not hypothetically, literally. My brother had no idea that the startup he bragged about working at, the one he claimed he practically carried on his back, existed because I had built it. Brick by brick, decision by decision, mistake by mistake, years before any of them had even walked through its doors. I stood there pretending their words didn't sting, pretending their jokes didn't cut deeper each time. I had kept my identity hidden for reasons they would never understand. Reasons I'll share soon. But that night, as their laughter echoed, I felt something shift. While they were busy tearing me down for sport, I was holding information that could dismantle their entire world. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I simply smiled, set my glass down, and walked out, knowing exactly what I would do next. Before I tell you what happened the moment that door closed and how everything in that house flipped upside down, let me ask you something first. What time is it where you are? And where are you watching from? I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Growing up, I learned that in our house, the scoreboard was invisible, but very real. My older brother, Ethan Dawson, always seemed to rack up points effortlessly, while I kept my own quiet tally off to the side. Our mother, Karen, never admitted to having a favorite, yet the way her face lit up at his smallest achievement said enough. When Ethan made a team at school, there were photos on the fridge. When I won a coding competition, she smiled, said she was proud, and returned to folding laundry. He was the golden child, the one everyone expected to succeed. I was the smart one, which in our family sounded more like a consolation prize than a compliment. By my early 20s, I understood that waiting for validation at home was pointless. I completed my degree, took a job at a small software firm, and spent nights sketching out an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. It was a platform I believed could truly help companies manage their work instead of drowning in spreadsheets. Seattle made sense. The city had enough tech talent to attract skilled people without overshadowing a new name. I rented a tiny desk in a co-working space, learned to pitch without sounding terrified, and watched small contracts grow into steady work. Eventually, I hired an engineer to help carry the load and moved the team into a floor of a glass office building in downtown Seattle. From the beginning, I kept my name off everything. The company was registered under a holding entity, with public listing attorneys and a registered agent handling it instead of me. I had seen people latch on to someone else's success the moment it looked promising. I wanted the freedom to build without every relative suddenly remembering my phone number. Meanwhile, Ethan bounced between sales jobs that never lasted. Sometimes he would call, frustrated, blaming bad managers or impossible quotas. Then, months later, he'd mention a restructure that always seemed to land on him. Our mother constantly worried about him, treating his instability like a storm the rest of us had to weather. When she discovered my company was thriving, her first reaction wasn't pride, it was a question. Could I secure something for Ethan? A position, an interview, a foot in the door, anything? She framed it as a favor, but the way she said it felt more like an obligation that came with my last name. I wrestled with it longer than I cared to admit. Mixing family and business was exactly what I had promised myself I wouldn't do. Yet, I also remembered the ways Ethan had supported me, driving me to early exams when my car broke down, standing up for me when other kids at school saw me as an easy target. In the end, I asked my operations lead to reach out to a recruiter we trusted. The brief was simple. There was an opening in our sales organization, and I knew a candidate who might fit. No mention that the founder was his sister, no special notes in his file. I wanted to see how he would perform on a level playing field. He interviewed well. The feedback came back positive, and he accepted the offer quickly. At first, it felt almost good hearing him speak about this startup he had just joined in Seattle, completely unaware that he was describing my life's work. Within the company, I stayed in the background. I was the founder on paper and in certain meetings, but day to day, my team interacted more with senior staff than with me. Ethan reported to a director, just another name on an org chart. I watched from a distance as he learned the product, joked with his team, and hit his first targets. The first warning signs were subtle. A comment in a performance review about his tendency to talk over quieter colleagues. A note from Human Resources regarding a complaint that never became formal. A passing remark from one of my managers that he brought a lot of energy, not all of it helpful. I read each line carefully, feeling a familiar pattern beginning to form around him. By the end of the first quarter, I sensed a shift beneath the surface of Ethan's team, subtle pressure that didn't show up in metrics but lingered in the edges of people's voices. I noticed it in passing comments from managers, in uneasy pauses when his name was mentioned, and in the nervous way newer employees avoided being alone near the break room at certain hours. I couldn't ignore it, even if I wanted to. I began spending more time quietly observing from hallways or joining meetings with my camera off, listening without announcing myself. It wasn't the content of the meetings that bothered me. Most teams stayed on track. It was the tone. Whenever Ethan took control, he dominated every discussion, cut people off mid-thought, and punctuated his ideas with a confidence that left no room for disagreement. When someone pushed back, even gently, he reacted with exaggerated humor that made others feel foolish for trying. Everything truly changed, however, when the message came from someone no longer with the company. A former employee, Mia Collins, requested a brief conversation. She had been one of our early hires, and I remembered seeing her name in a departure email 6 months earlier, with a vague note about seeking new opportunities. I hadn't questioned it at the time. Turnover happens. But when she asked to meet in person, something inside me tightened. We met at a quiet cafe a few blocks from the office. She looked different from the bright, eager employee I remembered, more cautious, as if measuring every movement. When she finally spoke, her words started haltingly, then gathered momentum, as though she had kept them sealed for too long. She described how things had shifted after Ethan joined, how he turned team meetings into arenas for his jokes, how the smallest mistakes became ammunition, and how certain people, including her, became targets for humor that was meant to appear harmless but never felt that way. She didn't cry and she didn't dramatize. She simply laid out the facts, the comments, the exclusion, the humiliation disguised as team bonding. She told me she had tried going to Human Resources, but the complaint didn't progress because she chose not to make it formal. She didn't want to be labeled sensitive in an industry that often punished that label. Listening to her, a slow, heavy anger settled in my chest. Not the quick flash of frustration I sometimes felt toward Ethan, but a quieter, colder version that made every detail hit even deeper. It wasn't just that he behaved poorly. It was that he created an environment where people like Mia felt cornered enough to leave work they excelled at. When she finished, she apologized as if sharing the truth were an inconvenience. I assured her it wasn't. I thanked her for trusting me, though I didn't reveal why her words mattered so much. She didn't know who I really was within the company, and I didn't disclose it. This conversation wasn't about my title. It was about the responsibility I now understood I carried. After she left, I sat for a long time, missing appointments I didn't bother to reschedule. The weight of her story no longer felt optional. It felt like a line had been drawn, one I could no longer ignore. Back at the office the next morning, I requested every HR document linked to Ethan's team. I read each line carefully, noting patterns that confirmed what Mia had shared. Small entries, tentative phrasing, enough to indicate discomfort but not enough to trigger formal investigations. I reviewed meeting recordings and internal chat logs, observing interactions with a sharper lens than before. There were no dramatic smoking guns, just a steady undercurrent of behavior that painted a clear picture. I didn't want scapegoats, I wanted clarity. To achieve it, I met with Lauren Park, my chief operating officer, the only person who knew I was the founder. I laid out what I had learned, protecting Mia's privacy by withholding her name until the end. Lauren listened, her expression tightening in the way it always did when something serious was at stake. She didn't rush to offer solutions. Instead, she asked pointed questions that forced me to articulate my fears, a culture subtly bending towards something I never intended to build. By the time our meeting ended, I knew what I had to do. The next steps wouldn't be gentle, and they wouldn't be quick, but avoiding them would allow the company to drift into a shape I no longer recognized, and that wasn't something I could allow. The day I decided to confront the truth inside my own company began quietly, as if the building hadn't yet caught up with my plans. I walked through the lobby with the same anonymity I had used for years, slipping past conversations and clattering keyboards without drawing attention. I wasn't hiding, I was observing, listening for the faint signal beneath the static. I had asked our recruiting coordinator to add a candidate to the mid-morning interview schedule. That candidate was me, though no one in that department knew it. I framed the request as part of an internal audit and kept the reasoning intentionally vague. People rarely question procedural tasks when they appear on their calendars with the right wording. My slot included several members of the sales team, names I recognized from the subtle complaints I had been tracking with growing concern. I didn't want summaries anymore. I needed first-hand clarity. I tied my hair back, wore neutral clothing, and used my middle name, Elena, when signing in. The conference room reserved for candidates felt smaller than I remembered, a space designed to test whether someone could remain composed under scrutiny. I took a steady breath, preparing not for their questions, but for the way they would ask them. They entered talking among themselves, voices casual, expressions relaxed. None of them acknowledged me as they settled in. Their conversation drifted from weekend plans to mocking a previous applicant. It wasn't loud, but the tone carried a sharpness that didn't require volume. They laughed in that effortless way people do when they are certain they hold the upper hand. When they finally turned their attention to me, the shift was immediate. The questions came quickly, rapid, pointed prompts meant to unsettle rather than assess. Each time I answered, they glanced at one another as if comparing reactions. Their expressions weren't curious, they were entertained. I kept my responses measured, careful not to betray how familiar their tactics felt. They interrupted often, not aggressively, but with the smooth confidence of people who interpret hesitation as weakness. None of them seemed interested in my skills. They wanted a performance, and the kind that made them feel superior. At one point, one of them received a text. He glanced at his phone, smirked, and tilted the screen toward the person beside him. A muffled laugh followed. It didn't matter what the message said. The reaction alone revealed everything I needed to know. Respect wasn't part of their process. Throughout the interview, I stayed inside my thoughts, cataloging details with a precision I had learned long before founding the company. Their body language, their exchanges, their dismissiveness, all of it formed a pattern far clearer than any HR summary I had reviewed. When they ended the session, they barely thanked me. I stood, nodded politely, and stepped into the hallway with a calm I didn't entirely feel. The door clicked shut behind me, and something inside me aligned with finality. I walked toward the elevator and pressed the button to the top floor. As it rose, the motion steadied my breathing. Whatever hesitation had lingered dissolved the moment the doors opened to my office. Inside, the city stretched across the windows, but my focus narrowed to the folder waiting on my desk, the evidence I had collected over days of monitoring and cross-checking. It wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency is what determines truth in a company. A few minutes later, Lauren Park, my chief operating officer, stepped into the room. I had asked her for a private meeting before the afternoon leadership session. She closed the door gently, a gesture that carried more reassurance than words. I outlined what I had seen in the interview, then paired it with the findings I had gathered. Early warning notes, subtle patterns in meeting recordings, quiet remarks from managers trying to stay professional. Lauren listened intently, her expression sharpening the way it always did when something fundamental was at risk. I told her I needed a full leadership meeting scheduled within the hour. No delays, no rescheduling. She nodded once, understanding both the urgency and the direction this was headed. As she prepared the logistics, I pictured the team returning to their desks downstairs, unaware of the storm already forming above them. They believed their behavior was confined to one interview room. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The leadership meeting began that afternoon once everyone had filed into the executive conference room with their laptops, their carefully practiced confidence, and unspoken assumptions about who controlled this company. I sat at the head of the long table, the familiar leather chair grounding me in ways I hadn't expected. It felt different today, less like a place of routine and more like a fulcrum. Across from me sat Tom Erickson, the head of sales and the highest-ranking figure connected to the interview panel I had observed earlier. This was the first time I had seen him up close since the quiet complaints had started arriving in my private inbox months earlier. He kept his posture straight, his expression measured, as if discipline alone could hide patterns that were already unraveling. I waited until the room settled before speaking. My voice didn't need to rise. Authority asserts itself naturally when it is certain of its path. I opened the meeting with questions that were simple on the surface, questions about culture, hiring decisions, and process consistency. I asked each leader to describe, without notes, how their teams approached candidate evaluation. Most answered with familiar lines about professionalism and fairness, words shaped more by policy handbooks than by actual behavior. Tom's response was polished, almost rehearsed. He spoke about maintaining high standards, pushing for excellence, and expecting candidates to demonstrate resilience. He never acknowledged the way his team had twisted those expectations into something smaller, something intended to intimidate rather than evaluate. I let him finish without interruption, even as he avoided making eye contact with me. Once the round of responses ended, I introduced the results of the internal audit I had been conducting. I presented the data first, leaving the emotion aside. Unusually high drop-off rates from candidates referred by certain recruiters. Disproportionately negative feedback associated with one interview team. Dismissed follow-ups that had quietly accumulated in my flagged items folder. The room shifted as the patterns formed a shape no one could pretend not to see. Then I described an interview I had witnessed that morning. I didn't name myself as the applicant, nor did I identify the interviewers. I spoke only about the behavior, the dismissive tone, the unnecessary interruptions, the unprofessional side comments. A few people stiffened. Others tried to maintain neutral expressions. Tom's jaw tightened, a small reaction, but unmistakable. I kept my explanation controlled, resisting the pull to turn frustration into sharpness. Frustration narrows the mind. Precision widens it. I told them I wasn't looking for apologies or excuses. I wanted clarity about why such behavior had gone unchallenged and why respect had slipped so easily from a process meant to build the company's future. Silence spread across the table, not accusatory, but heavy with calculation. I watched each person grapple with the implications. Some looked nervous, some appeared quietly relieved, as though they had been waiting for someone else to acknowledge what they already suspected. But Tom's expression hardened, as if the critique itself were an inconvenience rather than a necessity. I asked him directly when he had last reviewed his team's interview recordings. His answer came quickly, too quickly. He claimed he reviewed them regularly, though the fragment of uncertainty at the edge of his tone suggested otherwise. I didn't challenge the claim. The evidence resting in my private files would eventually speak louder than any verbal defense. I moved the meeting forward, outlining the changes that would begin immediately. Mandatory review protocols for all interview panels, anonymous candidate experience surveys linked directly to my office, and documented oversight for any team flagged twice within a quarter. I announced that every manager would be required to observe at least 2 interviews outside their department to broaden perspective and identify potential blind spots. These directives weren't punitive, they were structural, designed to correct a culture that had drifted off course. As the meeting progressed, tension rippled through the room. Some leaders asked cautious questions, others took notes with unusual diligence. Tom remained silent, his stillness sharper than any interruption. He understood what these changes meant. Oversight wasn't a threat, it was a mirror. And mirrors are unforgiving when someone has spent too long avoiding their own reflection. When the meeting ended, chairs slid back, laptops clicked shut, and people left with more thoughts than they were willing to voice aloud. I stayed seated until the room emptied, letting the quiet settle into something steady. This wasn't the confrontation I knew was coming. It was only the spacing between steps, necessary, deliberate, inevitable. The office grew quieter as the afternoon thinned, leaving long stretches of stillness between footsteps in the hallway. I used that quiet to return to the files that had been building across my private system. Each report added another shape to the problems I had begun uncovering, patterns that weren't dramatic at first glance, but became unmistakable once seen together. A new folder caught my attention, labeled with a name I hadn't directly addressed yet. Marcus Hale, Director of Operations. Employees mentioned him often in indirect ways, not accusing, but always hinting. He wasn't someone who created conflicts boldly, he allowed it passively. His version of leadership had left room for others to push boundaries they shouldn't have touched. I needed to know how far his negligence reached. As I read, a notification appeared on my screen. Marcus had requested a meeting. The timing felt deliberate, almost offensive, coming so soon after the leadership session. I approved it, curious to see what he would reveal without realizing it. When he arrived, he carried himself with a calmness that felt manufactured, the kind of composure built from habit rather than certainty. I invited him to sit, keeping my tone neutral while my thoughts focused sharply. He began with reassurances, broad comments about communication gaps, workload distribution, and the pressure his team had been under. He framed everything as external, as though the issues simply drifted into existence without anyone responsible for them. The vagueness was intentional, a way to speak at length without saying anything meaningful. I listened without responding, watching how he avoided specifics each time I waited for detail. He described concerns he supposedly had for months, yet nothing in the file suggested he had acted on them. His words were carefully arranged to create distance between himself and the realities his department had shaped. When he shifted to warning me about moving too fast, cautioning against disruptive structural adjustments, his intentions became clear. He wasn't protecting the company, he was protecting the comfort he had built by looking away. He ended the meeting with polite confidence, but as soon as he walked out, the room seemed to exhale. I finally understood his role. Not a villain, but a foundation stone that had weakened without anyone noticing. After he left, I opened a different folder, one with my brother's name. Mark's reports were harder to read, not because they surprised me, but because they didn't. I recognized the small, belittling remarks he made to employees, documented in anonymous notes. I recognized the pattern of underperformance masked by humor. The inconsistency in his leadership wasn't unfamiliar. It mirrored how he had treated me at family gatherings for years. He had carried that behavior into the office, assuming the company would tolerate it as our parents had. The difference now was that his actions had consequences here. Every review, every recording, every note built a picture that couldn't be softened or excused. His position was no longer protected by family ties. The truth didn't bend for him. Not anymore. Outside the window, the sun sank lower, leaving streaks of muted color across the city. I turned back to my schedule, mapping out the next steps. Audit sessions that would continue through the week, follow-up meetings with team leads, and a full structural review that couldn't be delayed any longer. The process wasn't vindictive, it was necessary. By the time I shut down my computer, the office was nearly empty. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the moment before a fault line shifts. Everything was moving beneath the surface, slowly but with direction. Tomorrow would narrow the distance between what I knew and what needed to happen, and the people who had hidden behind complacency or entitlement were finally running out of places to stand. The next morning arrived with sharp clarity, the kind that leaves no room for hesitation. I walked into the office before most employees had settled in, aware that the decisions I would make today would permanently alter both the structure of the company and the dynamic of my family. The evidence was complete. The patterns were clear. All that remained was execution. I called my first meeting of the day with the executive leadership team, ensuring every department head was present. The room filled slowly, but the tension arrived early. People sensed change long before anyone spoke it aloud. I took my seat and opened the folder containing final summaries, not as a threat, but as confirmation. I began with Marcus Hale, the director of operations. It was his first time hearing my assessment directly. I outlined the consistent failures in oversight, the gaps he had ignored for years, and the measurable impact his absence of leadership had left on the hiring process. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts carried their own pressure. When I informed him that his employment was terminated effective immediately, the silence in the room deepened, settling like dust over a surface left untouched too long. His expression tightened, not with surprise, but with recognition. He stood, nodded mechanically, and left without argument. Some people collapse under consequences. Others simply step aside when they finally face them. Next, I shifted my attention to the team responsible for the interview panel I had witnessed. Their actions weren't accidents. They were habits formed under leadership that never challenged them. I dismissed each of them on grounds of unprofessional conduct and repeated violations of internal policy. Some protested lightly, others stared at the table. None dared to pretend they hadn't known the lines they crossed. Accountability always feels harshest to those who believe they would never experience it. Then came the final name, the one that had lingered in my thoughts longer than any other: Mark. My brother entered after the leadership group had been dismissed, unaware of the decisions already made. The door closed behind him, leaving the room strangely small. I looked at him not as family, but as an employee facing documented misconduct. I informed him of the reports, the performance issues, the feedback, the recordings. He tried to joke at first, as if humor could dilute documentation, but humor has no traction when the truth stands without room to bend. When I told him his employment was terminated, the shock passed visibly across his face. He asked whether our parents knew. I told them they didn't need to. This decision belonged to the structure of the company, not the warmth of a living room. He stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and something deeper, the realization that our family dynamic no longer shielded him. He left without slamming the door. Somehow, that quiet exit felt heavier than any outburst could have. After the meetings ended, the office settled into a different kind of silence, one shaped by consequence, not anticipation. I walked through the halls, noting the stillness, the sense that something long neglected had finally been confronted. In the days that followed, the company adjusted faster than expected. With new oversight in place, interviews became fairer, employee feedback grew more candid, and the culture began shifting towards something steadier. Accountability, when applied evenly, becomes a foundation instead of a threat. My family, however, reacted differently. News of Mark's termination reached my parents faster than I expected. Their disappointment settled on me like a familiar weight, though it no longer pierced the way it once did. They insisted I should have protected him, but protection without consequence is not love. It's permission to keep harming others. I didn't argue. Some truths can't be taught through explanation. They must be lived through distance. And so the distance grew. Weeks later, as I sat in my office overlooking the city, I realized something quietly transformative. Endings don't always arrive with dramatic noise. Sometimes they appear as clarity, as a boundary finally recognized, as a life that no longer bends to accommodate what breaks it. This story for me wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility to myself, to the people who worked under my leadership, and to the future I was building without apology. And for those of you who stayed with me to the end, thank you. I hope you'll share what this story stirred in you, what part of it echoed something familiar, or what lesson you're taking away. I'd love to hear how far this story traveled and what it means from where you're listening.